That was very kind of you. You haven't heard me yet, though, so I mean, we should hold that. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I will say from the outset, this is not an opportunity for yet another Upper Canadian to tell Nova Scotians their business. I have roots here in the province as well. In fact, the family, part of the family comes from Cape Breton, and my stepfather in the 70s decided to build a house on St. Margaret's Bay, as many ex-Nova Scotians do, dreaming that in retirement he could come back. And so I had some misspent times on the shores of St. Margaret's Bay. So I feel very much at home here and have done research here for a while. So bear with me tonight. I'm Upper Canadian in my look, but in my heart, I'm much more cosmopolitan. I'd like to say two things, too, before I begin, and that is two words of thanks. Much of the work that we do now and that we have been doing on the Irish in Halifax owes a great deal to a genealogist researcher called Terry Punch. Terry's intrepid labors in uncovering who the Irish were, where they were located, when they came, and documenting it has been absolutely invaluable. And I think it should be stated publicly that he has been a provincial treasure for the Irish community here, and I want to express my thanks to Terry wherever he may be. And the second set of thanks goes to someone I called the good doctor yesterday, who immediately corrected me, Brian O'Brien, and the work that's gone on in Holy Cross Cemetery. My first encounter with Holy Cross was in 1994, and I was doing some field work on the Irish in Nova Scotia, particularly as related to military service, and I spent some time in the cemetery. I had a graduate student and I go through, and I was doing Michael Power research, and I mean, it really was in a state. I had seen worse in Canada, but it was in a state. When the good doctor, and I'm going to call him that anyway, took me for a tour in May with members of his volunteer team and explained what had been done, it was absolutely inspiring, and I think you have done amazing things, and I'd like to thank you publicly. So what's the next 45 minutes or so all about? You can see I don't like hanging around podia. I have a lot of nervous energy. I think had I been diagnosed, it would probably have been with ADD when I was in the second grade or something. So I will move around. I'll probably drive the cameraman nuts, but he's probably used to it. I'm going to use some visuals as well. What I was asked to do tonight essentially was to present kind of in broad brush strokes, very broad brush strokes, the North Atlantic diaspora of the Irish, principally in the early part of the 19th century, leading into the early 20th century, and in order to place Halifax in some sort of national and international context. Because I know the Trust plans on other lectures, and these will be far more granular over the course of the coming years in terms of nitty-gritty episodes, individuals, and phenomena that took place within the Irish experience here in Halifax. My job is to present a large canvas in which we can situate Halifax and situate the Irish Catholic community here. So that's my task tonight. And if you really get bored with me, at least you have some visuals to look at, and at least I'll have the satisfaction of knowing that something is keeping you awake before the Leafs play Nashville at 8. There are about 5 assumptions in the literature that have been debated over the last 30 years in Canada about the Irish, generally, okay? I'm going to present those 5 to you so you have a sense of where the debate is taking place. And if you have these hooks upon which to hang things, and you in your own research and your own thoughts then will have a sense of how do I situate this particular episode, or what does it mean in the broader sense of being Irish. First assumption is the Irish came during the famine. Now, this is not an unusual stance because for the United States, this was largely the case. Of course, there had been Irish immigration, Scots-Irish or Ulster Scots, depending on how you want to call them, coming to Appalachia other places in the United States prior to that. But this dramatic famine moment and the hundreds of thousands of Irish who came across the Atlantic and after 1847 principally to the United States really sets a set of what I would call not rose-colored lenses but green lenses through which the Irish experience everywhere in North America is read. And this is perpetuated through popular culture, and it also then becomes a touchstone of identity, of suffering, of victimization, is what American historian Kirby Miller would call this assumption of exile, being forced out. We've incorporated that in some way into both our popular narratives in Canada and in terms of some of our scholarly narratives as well. Okay? So there's assumption number one. Keep that in mind. Assumption number two, the Irish were Roman Catholic. Again, this is borrowed from the United States in some ways because the bulk of the Irish population in the United States became identified with being Roman Catholic. This, by the way, little graphic there. Most of the Irish from 1846 through to 1878 would have known this figure. It was Pope Pius IX. Pio Nono to those who admired him, Pio Nono to those who didn't. But the assumption even absorbed in Canada was, yes, when we talk Irish, Irish equals Catholic. So there's assumption number two. Assumption number three, the Irish lived in cities. Now, in some ways, this also has been perpetuated through the American scholarship and through American popular culture. I mean, you can probably think of the number of films that you've seen based on the Irish experience in the United States set in an urban setting. Think of Spencer Tracy in his film where he played the mayor of Boston and that scene of Knocko Minahan's funeral. And it's the fire department, the police department. I mean, the assumption that the Irish settle in cities is contagious. And it's adopted very much in Canadian scholarship. And sometimes it's adopted because for the very reason that cities are much easier to catch a population to study. And so it's not surprising when you look at the shelves of the books done on the Irish in Canada. There's Montreal, there's Toronto, there's St. John's, there's St. John, New Brunswick, okay? There's London, Ontario, Hamilton, a few essays on Halifax. But this is a major assumption. This is your little bit of Upper Canada for tonight. This is Toronto as it looked in 1849. So much nicer then than today. I live in Whitby, by the way, which is deliberate. It's 50 kilometers outside of the Big Smoke. Assumption number four, the Irish were poor. Those lazy, illiterate, alcohol-prone, feckless paddies that pour into the continent by the tens and hundreds of thousands. This is an assumption that comes out of the American literature. It's also one that comes out of the Canadian literature as well. And it's one that is challenged. So there's assumption number four. Assumption number five, the Irish were disloyal. Well, disloyal to whom? They were disloyal to the British Crown. And of course, this particular assumption has good historical feet to it. If you look at the history of Ireland, which many of you are familiar with, and you look at the trials and tribulations of the Irish at the hands of the Tudors and the Stuarts, if you look at the revolution, the insurrection of 1798, the Fenian movement, I mean, all of this reinforces, in addition to what would be tantamount to agrarian terrorism in the early 19th century within Ireland, reinforces this idea that not only are the Irish people violent, okay, but they're inherently disloyal against the British Crown. Some would say, and reasonably so, because the British Crown has been an oppressor since the time of the 12th century. So let's keep these five assumptions in mind, because much of what is written in Canada about the Irish has been grounded either in acceptance or refuting one of these five big assumptions. So there we are. And just recapping, how do we come to this? Okay, well, there's the dominance of American historical scholarship. Whereas in Canada we may have a dozen or so historians working on questions Irish, there are hundreds in the United States working on questions Irish. There is an industry in the United States that produces a vast literature that feeds into many of these assumptions. And of course, we read them. As a good scholar does, you read the secondary literature and you try to figure out what are the other guys doing. We might get some ideas. We might borrow. Okay? Popular culture supports the myths. I've mentioned cinema. You know, it's cinematographic stereotypes of the Irish. I mean, they stick in our minds. You think of the priest. Who do you think of? Father O'Malley, Bing Crosby, you know? Barry Fitzgerald, maybe, you know? You think of a stereotype of the feisty one. Would Maureen O'Hara come to mind? The tough little hairpin, Jimmy Cagney. I mean, we could go on ad nauseum about how American popular culture, which has also been consumed quite liberally north of the border, has fed into this. It's also been self-validated by Irish communities in Canada. They see these as identifiers that they can lock onto. What does it mean to be Irish? And it becomes incorporated in the way in which some Irish communities in Canada see themselves. There are contested Irish narratives in Canada. Certainly scholars who challenge some of these assumptions are then in turn challenged by members of the Irish community who say, "You have just perpetuated the great lie." I'm going to be avoiding nationalist politics tonight completely. But you can understand how volatile some of these issues are. And why are they volatile? Because they're important. They wouldn't be volatile if they weren't important. And finally, one of the things that I contest in a lot of my work is, I think that one of the assumptions that is drawn out of this is somehow we do have a creature called the Irish Canadian. And I don't believe we do. I don't believe we have an Irish Canadian, even insofar as we have a model of English Canadian. Because as I'm going to present, Irish show themselves very differently from region to region and from context to context. And they grow in different ways in different parts of Canada. So now that you've got the sort of broad questions that we ask, why is it, for those of us who visit Ireland frequently, why would people want to leave? Okay, why leave Ireland? It's one of my favorite graphics. Unfortunately, you don't get the full part of it because here it actually says Quebec, something class. So he's looking at coming to Canada, not just New York. So why did they leave? There's Ireland itself. Well, there were the wild geese. They were among the first to leave. This is actually at Rathmullen up in County Donegal, on the Fanaid Peninsula, a depiction of that departure in the early 17th century of the Earls, the flight of the Earls. So O'Neill and O'Donnell leaving, as so many did, as a result of being on the wrong end of the wars fought with the English. Joining, for example, the armies of France and Spain in Europe and disseminating throughout Catholic Europe, oftentimes as key players within the armies of Catholic Europe. So the one reason of leaving was, having been defeated at home, there was the hope of coming back, but at the same time serving in the armies of others. And in fact, the first Irish who end up in Canada actually end up in New France. Admiral Charles Latouche McCarthy, okay, is stationed in New France. He's an Irish expat who marries into a French family and eventually settles in New France and then is relocated. A fellow by the name of Timothy Sullivan, a deserter from the English army, captured in New England, escapes, goes to Quebec, and actually there's a process of francisation in his name. Sullivan becomes Sylvain. And he is actually the stepfather of St. Margaret Youville, the founder of the Grey Sisters. Sullivan. A name like Lehay in New France becomes Lehays. Leahy becomes Lehays. And some even speculate that Riley becomes Riel. They speculate. But the wild geese are one reason why Irish leave. They also leave because they are indentured elsewhere, again on the wrong side of the law or the wrong side of a conflict. Many don't know that one of Cromwell's acts as he concluded his conquest and ravaging of Ireland was the sending of 30,000 Irish as indentured servants to the Caribbean. And so actually interesting, if you want to read up, Don Akinson has written this Irish History of the World. It's massive. He once referred to it as, do you want to read a history of the world with all the boring people taken out? Read my book. And interesting, the first volume largely focuses on these indentured servants from Ireland who are sent to the Caribbean and make good, okay, and actually take over the sugar operations in many of the islands in the British Empire. This actually is a scene of the other sort of forced indentureship. This is Newcastle, New South Wales. Of course, you leave Ireland as a guest of the Crown to spend the rest of your days in a penal colony somewhere in the Antipodes. The fishery, another reason to leave. Less a pull factor, or less a push factor, but more a pull factor. Irish fishermen on the southeast coast drawn to the Grand Banks for economic reasons. And I'll elaborate in a few minutes as to what this means for a more permanent settlement. A push factor. In the early 19th century, mechanization takes hold of the very lucrative cotton weaving industry in Northern Ireland. And so in the early 19th century, many Irish from Ulster are pushed out because the local craft of weaving is eliminated by industrialization. So in the 1820s and the 1830s, not surprised, there are many Ulster migrants who are pushed out. One of the places they come, British North America, and to the United States. So the collapse of weaving and linen. Another push factor, and certainly really important for our purposes, between 1815 and 1845, the collapse of the international economy, at least so far as Britain was concerned, at the end of Napoleon's wars. Here we have a case of new suppliers being opened up because the shipping lanes are now free. The Baltic becomes once again active in trading. Ireland is at a point where its prices begin to fall, okay? And this coincides with a population that's reasonably well fed, multiplying exponentially. A population that goes from early in the century from about 6 million to 1841 when it's 8 million. So a population rise, an economy in crisis, and a land system that is certainly not to the benefit of those tenants, okay, who are facing increasing pressure because of larger families to subdivide their land. The subdivision of land, okay, between families, if you don't get land, you have to leave. If you do get land, there's very little of that land that you can use for crop. So it's not surprising that in this period, the Irish become heavily dependent on a crop that will provide for them all of the nutrients they will need for their families. So it's not that unusual that that falls to the lumper potato, okay, in most counties except Antrim and Down, as essentially the crop upon which this rising population will depend. Smaller land holdings and landlords who would love to get rid of these small land holdings to open up their lands to animal husbandry and herds, which is far more lucrative than crops at this point, given the state of the international economy. So there's an economic, a social, a demographic, and a land crisis in Ireland that is pushing people out by the tens of thousands. Okay? Another reason to leave. I'll elaborate on that in specifics in a few minutes. Another reason to leave, the Great Famine. Perhaps the great push of the early 19th century. This is actually John Bahan's National Memorial at the foot of a fog-bound Crowpatrick in County Mayo. Of course, that 8 million population is reduced dramatically when the potato crop fails in 1845 in 23 counties out of the 32, and then fails again in all counties in 1846, creating a crisis that really has no parallel in modern Irish history. And what it means is that 1 million people die by the end of this period, and another 1.5 million leave. And the population of Ireland by the end of this crisis is under 6 million. The population of Ireland has never recovered since the famine. This is what we call a touchstone moment in Irish history, but it also is an important moment of push. And remember, too, that the poorest of the Irish died where they had lived. Those with some means went to England, And those with the most they could scratch together, the 3 pounds or so per person on board a sailing craft, went to British North America or the United States. And I'm going to elaborate on this in a few minutes, but I want to give you a sense of there are many different reasons for leaving Ireland, both pushes and pulls. And finally, there's the ongoing sojourning in Ireland. If you can't find work in Ireland, then maybe you can find it elsewhere, as a taddy haker or as a canal worker in England or Scotland, working on railways in Great Britain, and sending remittance money back home. This is actually taken out of McGowan's Klondike Diary. This is off the main street in Letterkenny, and it's the children waiting for prospective employers to come along and pick them up and take them away for the summer months. Usually taking the children away locally, but young men and women being taken to places like Scotland, Wales, or industrial England. So this is yet a push because there is nothing there in Ireland for them to do, and it's also a pull because they know where they can have money to send back as remittances. And of course, we all know the story that many end up remaining in the places where they had gone to employment. So we have our assumptions about the Irish, we have why those assumptions may exist, and now we have a sense of what it is that pushes or pulls the Irish to North America and elsewhere. Let's take a look at Newfoundland first. I mean, because really the story of the Irish in Canada, the story of the Irish in British North America really begins in Newfoundland. And most of this story is, again, the pull of the fishery. And it begins as early as the 17th century as hundreds of fishermen, mostly from Waterford, Wexford, South Tipperary, South Kilkenny, that southeastern portion of Ireland, make regular annual trips to the Grand Banks to catch, of course, the cod, the beef of the sea. And they go back at the end of the season. But the British system of salting the cod is a dry system. So racks are set up on shore, so these fishermen have to land. Eventually, they end up settling where their racks are. And suddenly the British have a problem. They didn't want a colony built around a fishery. They just wanted a fishery. And now they have what they consider to be an unmanageable population, which grows over the course of the period of the 18th, early 19th century to about 30,000 people. Okay, so remember, this is 1830. When does the famine begin? 1845-46. Okay, so in Newfoundland, we already have thousands of Irish already settling there in the bays, Conception Bay, Trinity Bay, Placentia Bay, around the Irish Loop here on the Avalon Peninsula, and in St. John's. And they all come from this particular region of Ireland. And if you were to plot the names today, you would find the names in Waterford and Wexford replicated tenfold in places like Harbour Grace and St. John's and Ferryland and Trepassey, all along the Irish Loop. But Newfoundland becomes really one of the first homes of the Irish in British North America. Then you get this interesting phenomena of if Newfoundland's not good enough, these particular Irish decide to get on another boat and go elsewhere. So over the course of that late 18th, early 19th century, you have the two-boater phenomenon. So Irishmen who have gone, and Irish women who have gone to Newfoundland, finding it difficult in the sort of fluctuating character of the fishery, going elsewhere in Atlantic Canada to settle. And they're called two-boaters. They got on one boat to go to Newfoundland, they got on a second boat to go somewhere else. And where did they go? Well, they went to the Miramichi here in northern New Brunswick. They went to Prince Edward Island, okay? They end up in Halifax as well, which I'll explain reasons why in a moment. Some of them even settle in the Margaree area of Cape Breton. So in fact, what is significant about the appearance of the Irish in the maritime provinces is the fact that many of them didn't come directly from Ireland. They're two-boaters. And so do you ever wonder why names like Walsh and Tobin, etc., sort of pop up in the Miramichi and Prince Edward Island, and even in Halifax? Dollars to donuts, folks, that you may not be scratching the result of a direct migration from Waterford or Wexford. You may be scratching a two-boater who may have spent a generation in Newfoundland before that family moved on. So the two-boater phenomena is important. New Brunswick becomes an important place for settlement, principally because the port of St. John in New Brunswick is linked to Londonderry or Derry, whichever you prefer. I'm not going to get into that argument tonight. We can save that for later. And Cork. So over the course of the period after 1815, so in that period of the post-Napoleonic economic downturn, and in that time when the weavers were being put out of business in Ulster, it's not surprising that tens of thousands of Irish decide to migrate to the New World, and they do so through the port of St. John, to the extent that New Brunswick becomes one of the most Irish colonies in British North America. In fact, there is even a time when they're considering calling it New Ireland. Up to 35% of the population of New Brunswick by mid-century is of Irish origin. Now, with the tens of thousands of Irish pouring into New Brunswick, one would think it might even be higher, but St. John, of course, becomes a stepping stone to what they call the Boston States. So you might land at St. John, stay there for a little while, move up if you're fortunate enough into the St. John River Valley, but much of that land has been settled already by Loyalist stock. You have better opportunities in places like Boston, Portland, Connecticut, and New York. But New Brunswick is a very important Irish presence in the Maritimes, as is Prince Edward Island, where it constitutes the third largest ethnic group on PEI. PEI, though, is very similar in terms of the two-boater phenomena to the Miramichi, and that is that some of the principal Irish residents in Prince Edward Island are actually two-boaters. They're joined also by those from the southeast of Ireland. Why? Because there's so many Southeast Irish already here that they've heard about it, and these migration chains begin to build. One of the things that's attractive about Prince Edward Island, believe it or not, in the early days is the fact that land is available. Even though Prince Edward Island is rather unique in terms of the fact that the entire island is divided up into 67 units, okay, with 67 landlords and tenancy, something that the Irish have already known, but don't seem to be adverse to as they settle in Prince Edward Island in the early years. There'll be a whole literature and a whole history written about resistance to landlordism thereafter, okay? And you'll often find Irish at the center of that in Prince Edward Island. But just to let you know that Prince Edward Island becomes one of the large catch basins. And if we were to do an analysis of who's there, no particular region dominates other than the southeast and a group of settlers that come from County Monaghan. So if you go to Prince Edward Island today, you'll notice a lot of County Monaghan names, family names, and also place names from County Monaghan. That seems to be the one area of Ireland that makes Prince Edward Island somewhat distinctive in our Irish migration history. Okay? So let's get down to the nitty-gritty then. There's our maritime colonies. It gives you a sense of where the settlement is. Okay? And Nova Scotia is right in the middle of this migration. Before I get to this graphic, I just talk about Nova Scotia. I mean, there are Irish migrants here as early as 1749 when Lord Cornwallis needs workers to build the fortifications in what is to be the counterbalance to Louisbourg, the French fortifications on Cape Breton. By about 1815, Halifax has become one of the more important catch basins of Irish migration. And by 1837, about 35% of Halifax is either of Irish birth or Irish extraction. By 1851, it's up to about 42%. One of the things that makes Halifax rather distinctive is the fact that there are so many Irish concentrated here. And what's interesting, if we looked at our map of Nova Scotia, and I'll go back to it, okay, we would find that we would be hard-pressed to find huge pockets of the Irish outside of Halifax. I mean, they are there, but they're not as significant as the concentration that takes place in Halifax, parts around the Sydneys in Cape Breton, and in the Margaree Valley. Tony Mackenzie's written a really interesting expose of the Irish of Cape Breton. It's not the first thing you think about when you think about Cape Breton Island, but they're there, and they're quite prominent in the population. In fact, the Antigonish movement owes a great deal to two priests of Irish ethnicity, Jimmy Tompkins and Moses Cody. So here's an interesting irony in what is usually claimed in popular culture to be one of the most Scottish areas, and the Acadians could make some claim for part of it as well, and up in Cheticamp. It's really an Irish presence that often percolates to the surface in that part of Nova Scotia. But Halifax is significant for its concentration of Irish at a very early time, and the significance of that population in terms of its numeric power and its percentage power in the city. I mean, they constitute about 80 to 90% of the Catholic population in the city. They are prominent, they are well known in the city, and again, the Halifax tends to be an interesting mix of two-boaters and those from the southeast of Ireland. Now I'll go to that graphic that'll really show you what I'm talking about is, can we say that there really is a singular notion of an Irish Canadian? This is a map of Ireland, two maps of Ireland. The first one is based on routinely generated records to try to figure out where do the Irish of Halifax come from. Okay, well, what did I just say? Here in Tipperary, Kilkenny, Waterford, Wexford, East Cork, some in Kerry, but you see the big bubbles are down here. Here's New Brunswick. They are Munster and Ulster predominant. Very different, okay, communities in terms of origins. Very different provinces in which they settle, with a different economic basis, different host populations, and this will be significant for the growth of these communities, where they come from, when they come, and who are there within the community that they join, and sometimes welcomed rather reluctantly. Okay? So, if you're still with me, I'm going to really test the waters here. There's a nice view of Halifax in the early 19th century. There's a shot of the original structure where St. Mary's Cathedral stands. There's an early graphic dating from the early 1820s. You notice, here's my nod to St. Mary's. The plaque in front of it still says the original St. Mary's founded there at the corner. Yeah. Michael Power, a noted Irish Catholic from Halifax, born of Waterford and Cork parents, very typically then, and of course makes his name in the church, Catholic Church in Quebec, and eventually in Toronto, where he dies in 1847 on October 1st, having contracted typhus, serving the famine migrants to that city. Which brings me to the Canadas. We can't talk about this migratory process without dealing with where most of the Irish go in the mid and late 19th century. They go to Lower and Upper Canada. And in fact, in these centers, the Irish are significantly urban. For example, in Quebec, okay, and we do have an extension of our map here, when the Irish come between 1815 and 1845, many of them congregate in Lower Town in Quebec. Those who move on to the city of Montreal, where they become a significant minority. By 1830, about 7,000 out of 32,000 citizens of Quebec are of Irish birth or origin, and in Montreal, around the same time, it's roughly 3,000 out of 20-odd thousand and growing. Montreal, because of its growing industrial base, becomes a very popular spot for the Irish to stop. That doesn't mean they were entirely urban in Lower Canada, or what is now Quebec. There were pockets of the Irish in the St. Francois River Valley, in the eastern townships, some of whom would come up from the United States, and many in the Ottawa Valley, which is actually where I'm from, is from the Ottawa Valley. When you refer to the valley here, I know it's the Annapolis Valley in Ontario. When we refer to the valley, it's the Ottawa Valley, where we speak neither official language, but quickly. So up Pontiac County, you could find Irish from all parts of Ireland, certainly not as concentrated from one particular area of Ireland as you see in New Brunswick, in Nova Scotia, or at least in Halifax, or in Newfoundland. There's Montreal. There's Montreal again. Very different from what it looks like now. Much easier to drive through than now. One of the things that happens to the Irish in Montreal that I think is worthy of note, and again, it reflects what I said before about when do they come, where do they come from, and who do they arrive among. My thesis supervisor way back in the day, in 1971, coined this term double minority. What happens to the Irish when they find themselves in a place where they are a minority in terms of their religion among the principal linguistic group, and they are a minority linguistic group among the majority within their religion? And in Montreal, they land right in the middle of this status. And this is important, I think, and really hasn't been taken seriously enough by scholars. And that is, you plunk an Irish Catholic group in a city which is ostensibly run by English-speaking Protestants, and who make the city run are French-speaking Catholics. And the Irish find themselves in their own church, a minority, and within their own linguistic group, a minority. That tends to bring out different things in that community. Well, they can't wear the badge of Catholic identity, and they certainly can't bear the signs of, being Anglo in some way as a linguistic group. And I think that Montreal historically becomes one of these cauldrons of Irish identity, and continues to be, because the one badge that they can wear and they can cultivate and they can nurture is the badge of Irishness. Double minority. Same with my hometown, Ottawa. Again, double minority status. Same with Winnipeg. Double minority status. We go across the river to St. Boniface to be with our Catholic brethren. They don't want us there. We go back across the river to Portage in Maine. This is Protestant country. Okay, so it's a very interesting dynamic from which to explore the development of community identity. Very different from other places where the Irish are in Canada. Of course, we get to Upper Canada. Now, this is modern conveniences of the 1840s, shooting the Lachine Rapids. And of course, the Irish settle here in a variety of places, certainly in centers like Kingston, Toronto, Hamilton, and eventually in the western portion in London. And there are large agricultural Irish communities here in the Ottawa Valley, in Peterborough, where we have the first and only block settlement of the Irish in Canada, sponsored by Peter Robinson in 1823 and 1825. And they all come from one region of Ireland. They come from the Blackwater district of North Cork and some parts of Tipperary. So they're from one region, they lock in. Okay? We also have, of course, Perth County, which is very Irish, and of course the famous Donnelly country in Middlesex County. Everybody's heard of the Donnellys, and they're an anomaly. One family gets massacred, and then suddenly the Irish have yet another black eye that they have to live down for the better part of a century, and still are. So Upper Canada, okay, also becomes a diving board for, of course, Upper New York State, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and the American Midwest. So a different configuration there. The agricultural frontiers are clear. The Ottawa Valley, Peterborough, Agila, Perth County, Middlesex, Essex in the far west, just so that you can, well, I can pine for the fjords maybe. Toronto as it looked in the 1840s. Hamilton without the steel mills and the tiger cats. Windsor, Essex, looking over at Detroit, a very different skyline in the 1840s than there is today. And of course, the Irish did make it up as far as what is now Thunder Bay and the Lakehead, both in the fur trade and in the lumbering industries. So we now have a continent that's beginning to be covered by these Irish migrants beginning in the 16th century and now coming full steam by the 1850s and the 1860s. Now, the interesting thing about the Irish west of the Ottawa River is that most of them are Protestant. Don Akinson did the counting, and it continues to be counted. I have students working on townships. About 65% were Protestant and 35% were Catholic. And these Protestants generally came from the South. They were the ones who left during the reprisals by the White Boys and Ribbon Men and a variety of agrarian societies. These are people who looked for a better opportunity in British North America generally in terms of their farming during this post-Napoleonic period. But this presents to us a really interesting picture of a community that's quite different. In New Brunswick, it's about 50-50, Irish Protestant, Irish Catholic. In Quebec, it's a majority Irish Catholic. In Newfoundland, it's a majority Irish Catholic. In Prince Edward Island, it's a majority Irish Catholic. In Halifax and the rest of Nova Scotia, majority Irish Catholic. And here is where the fly gets into the ointment. Not only is Ontario attracting more Irish migrants, but they have more Protestants, and it throws our national religious count in a bit of a tailspin. And then, of course, we have the famine. And famine migrants come to British North America mostly in 1846 and 1847. And in fact, the peak of Irish migration actually takes place in 1847, when close to 110,000 migrants leave for British North America. That is all colonies. Most of those individuals, this is the sculptures that are mirrored in Toronto, these are on Dublin Quay. Most of those migrants go to central Canada. Okay? Out of those 110,000, about 85,000 go to Quebec. And I just wanted to show you this graphic, just to give you a sense. Limerick is the key city in terms of Quebec migration. Cork, a little bit so, but Liverpool, of course. These are two boaters of a different kind, from Ireland to Liverpool and beyond. So of that 110,000, which is really the peak of all migration, after 1847, migration from Ireland completely drops. 30,000s, 20,000s, and then just thousands. And sometimes, definitely less than 4,000 or 5,000 a year. It trails off. This is it. The famine doesn't begin the migration. The famine, interestingly enough, is an end point to mass migration. And most of them go here. Let's compare this graphic with New Brunswick. Look at that. Remember, Limerick, big in Quebec, not big in St. John. But Cork is the major supplier. And we already know why. There are already links between Cork and St. John. Derry, still holding its own at 13. Liverpool, far less. Why? Fewer trade links between St. John and Liverpool. Out of the 110,000, about 17,500, end up in New Brunswick, many of whom move on. Now, let's put Halifax in this context. Hold your breath. There we are. The famine migration was not significant in Halifax. The Irish essentially were already here before the famine. In fact, I have to asterisk Limerick because that boat doesn't even land in Halifax. It lands in Pictou. Maybe it thought it was the Hector. I don't know. All right? But Cork and Galway are the chiefs. Only 6 ships land. It's said by the Colonial Office that 2,000 people come to Nova Scotia during the famine. All of the head counting that has been done by Terry Punch and Morse and others, and even yours truly, suggests that probably no more than 1,300 were actually Irish landing in Halifax out of that 2,000. So the famine is a drop in the bucket in terms of Irish migration to Halifax. The Irish are already here. Now, the question has been asked, well, why is this so? Okay? Well, one of the reasons is because the Nova Scotians made it abundantly clear in January of 1847 that they didn't want any famine migrants. In fact, Sir John Harvey, the governor of Nova Scotia, writes to the colonial secretary at that point, Earl Grey, and said, "It would not be to the advantage of the Irish to come here, nor to our advantage." He said, and I'll quote because sometimes people say I make this up as I go along, okay? So let's just quote from the good governor. "Extreme privation and misery would therefore necessarily be the lot of those who should come hither in search of any kind of employment, okay, without the same subsistence for at least 2 years. Nor should they rely, as the practice has been, on obtaining assistance from their friends who have preceded them, for they would assuredly be found as such a need of aid as the migrants themselves." What was Harvey saying? Harvey was saying quite clearly that the economy would not sustain Irish migration here. There had been a hope that the Intercolonial Railway would start building through Nova Scotia in hopes of linking to New Brunswick and perhaps the Canadas. That wasn't materializing, and he's very clear in 1847 that's not going to happen. So there's no work. And he said, we have a famine of our own. And this may be one of the forgotten things in Nova Scotia history. Because in 1845, 46, and 47, the same Pitafora infestans that was destroying the crop in Ireland and in parts of Scotland was destroying potato crops in British North America. In fact, there is one case that's made that the Irish contamination really comes from North America. Pennsylvania, New York State have had the blight, and it moves east. And by 1846-47, it hits Cape Breton and eastern Nova Scotia with a vengeance. I've gone through the petitions to the Legislative Assembly. Hundreds of people writing to the government saying, we have no food. We are absolutely destitute. There is a famine here. And that's why Harvey ends off his letter by saying, what they will meet here is what they are leaving in Ireland. Many people don't know that the population of the Margaree Valley was in severe crisis during this period as their potato crops were destroyed. The one advantage that Nova Scotians had was that they had more crop diversity than their Irish cousins, okay? And that's one of the reasons why these numbers are so low. The government says no and gives a good reason. I mean, this really is that proverbial Nova scarcity that they talked about historically, okay? But those who did go on went to Grosse Île. You know that story. Close to 5,000, over 5,000 died there, commemorated in 1909 by the Ancient Order of Hibernians. Others went on to Montreal. This was a stone called the Black Stone, sacred space for the Irish of Montreal, commemorating the dead that were actually found by construction workers when they were building the Victoria Bridge in the 1850s at Pointe Saint-Charles. And of course, Toronto. More pristine look at Toronto Harbor. This is actually Fort York in Toronto, and it's currently almost under the Gardiner Expressway. And the Toronto Island Airport would be over here, just to give you a contemporary look. They came, 38,000 descended on Toronto in 1847. Toronto had a population of 20,000. It just beggars the imagination. And they all came between May and September. The population of Toronto today is about 5 million. When I talk to people in Toronto about how staggering this might be in our current day, think of 10 million people coming in a very short period having to be handled within the population of Toronto today. Now, of course, there's much greater infrastructure, but still, the numbers are staggering. This is actually a shot from the film Death or Canada. I like it because it gives you a greater sense of reality than some of the lithographs. There's a whole story in trying to be a historian and keep your integrity and your patience while people are making a film about what you've written about. That's a topic of another day. The hospital there, this is a dramatization of Mike. I thought I'd put this in because here's our Halifax link to the famine in Toronto. This actor plays Michael Power as he's going through the sheds. And of course, as I said, his own priests were sick with typhus, a rickettsia bacteria that we can solve quite easily by antibiotics today. But in those days, they didn't know how to handle it. In this particular case, highly infectious. Power spent time in the sheds, contracted the disease, and died before his 43rd birthday in 1847. A Haligonian who had made his reputation elsewhere, but was always remembered as one of the significant players. In fact, when he died, Egerton Ryerson, the father of education in Ontario, referred to his esteem of Power and said, Power was almost Canadian. A high tribute for a Nova Scotian, he thought, you know. Anyway, we have this interesting mix now, okay, of origins. You compare the origins of the Maritimes that I showed you to the origins in Ontario, and look at that. Ontario is a dog's breakfast of places of origin. It's very different. This was taken from routinely generated records in Toronto. These would be baptismal, marriage, and cemetery records. So social historians like me like to talk about, you know, hatching, matching, and dispatching. And there's a lot that's in those records. And certainly it shows us, you know, a greater spread of that Irish population in Ontario than in Halifax, okay, or in New Brunswick. And I still call to mind, you know, there's something called an Irish Canadian. Well, we've got to really look at this carefully in terms of origins and development. So, Halifax, Irish famine refugees. Assumption number one. No, we can lay that assumption easily to rest. There's no empirical evidence to suggest that the famine moment is a signal moment. It may have affected the community psychologically, and we need a good study of something like that, where this trauma is something that affects not only the people who arrive, ever they be so small, but perhaps the community at large who identify with countrymen. I think there's still research to be done there, okay, as to the psychological effect. But in terms of the assumption, number one, as it applies to Halifax, not right now. Assumption number two, Halifax Irish Catholic. Yeah, that one works. Our routinely generated records show us a great deal that would substantiate that. Thirdly, Halifax Irish urban. Yeah, I think that's a no-brainer, okay, in terms of our demographic knowledge. But what's interesting is that the current research project is really going to unpack what kind of urban activity and what kind of urban people they really were. How this community evolves over time. So although we might dismiss this assumption in terms of Halifax, what we would want to look at, and I think what this SHRP team is going to be looking at in conjunction with the Holy Cross Cemetery Trust is to try to determine how this community develops as an urban community over time. So even though this assumption looks to be a self-evident truth, there's much more that can be done in terms of the Halifax experience. Halifax Irish poor. This becomes an important question that I think the SHRP project looks at. And that's why the cemetery database at Holy Cross is so very valuable, because it gives us raw data about real people, where they live, that can be cross-referenced then to other data. And it's through building these databases and getting big data that we're able to empirically say, did these people develop occupationally over time? Did these people develop spatially from neighborhood to neighborhood over time? And we can plot it. And we can say to the gainsayers, who would prefer an American cultural stereotype, we can say, well, the numbers, okay, and the records don't bear this out. Or maybe they do bear it out. And that's the excitement of this particular project. It's kind of the excitement that brought an Upper Canadian to come and see what contribution I could make. Because this is exciting stuff for a socialist. And I couldn't have chosen a better graphic. I mean, it's holy ground, folks. It really is. I said yesterday to a group, I said, on a hockey team, not necessarily the Toronto Maple Leafs, but on a hockey team, you build from the goalie out. This is our goalie. This is our strength. We build out that way. And there's so many questions regarding this assumption. And finally, we're the Halifax Irish loyal. That's pretty much one of the questions that I'm posing within this project. And in fact, I'm looking at, quite seriously, the routinely generated records left by recruits in the Boer War and World War I. And there were many. In fact, Cornelius O'Brien, Archbishop, O'Brien, who himself was a Prince Edward Islander, who came here. He was a three-boater, I guess, at this point. He was a member of the Imperial Federation League. His successor, Archbishop McCarthy, encouraged recruitment. This is a shot of the Catholic chaplains from Canada, some of them with Michael Francis Fallon, the Bishop of London, Ontario. But interspersed here are Nova Scotians, New Brunswickers, British Columbians, chaps from Ontario and Quebec, Prince Edward Island, and most of whom are of Irish Catholic extraction. They dominate the chaplaincy corps. They also dominate the Catholics numerically in the Canadian Expeditionary Force in World War I. And part of my job is to pull together another database to get a sense of who they were, the Haligonians in that particular case. So loyalty, the jury is still out as we work on that in Halifax. And you know what? I've given you the 5 assumptions, or offered the 5 assumptions, some filler to give you a sense of where you come from within the big picture and whether or not the assumptions hold up here or is there more work to do. And always in our business of history, there's always more work to do. So that's it for me. And I think I could take probably about 2 questions or 3 questions if you have them. But that's the core. I saw Peter McGuigan's hand shoot up immediately. Peter?
Yes, I'm Mark. I almost finished my book on the South Street Poorhouse, and that was an Irish institution. But the book was alcoholic institutions, sort of two went together there in the Victorian era. But the people in the South Street Poorhouse only constituted about 300 or 400 of the Irish in Halifax, so they weren't typical, but they were typical of the poor who drank excessively.
Now, Peter, is there a ledger that identifies these people and gives a...
On the side of it, I was 60% of the people in the poorhouse in 1870 were Catholic, and therefore would be Irish in Halifax. So 40% of the general population were Irish in Halifax. But that only constituted about 300 or 400 people out of 100,000 were in Halifax who were Irish Catholics. So just, they weren't typical, but they were typical of the drinking people who were drinking drunken, who in too many cases drunk themselves in the poorhouse. Now also poor Irish who didn't drink as well. So there was a real alcohol problem in the poorhouses in the Victorian era. In the 20th century, it faded to some extent and to more of an old age home.
Right. This would be really interesting data, sort of pull into the other data sets that are being built. So thanks for doing that work, Peter. Thanks very much. Any other questions? I've really thoroughly bored you to death. Bring on the hockey game. Yes?
Just going back to comparing the Canadian and U.S. context that you kind of
No, I mean, and it's really curious. I was at the American Historical Association in New Orleans seems like a year ago. It was in January, and I was in a session on Catholicism and Black America. And to me, it was so historically dissimilar, you know, in terms of there were scholars of the Irish there were scholars of African Americans, and there are just no similar categories in Canadian scholarship. Where we do have some interesting interplay, and I think it goes back to John Moyer's idea of the double minority, and that is when the Irish in Canada, depending on where they are, position themselves in comparison to the other. And so what we see is comparisons being made in Montreal, let's say, between Irish working class and French Canadian Catholic working class. Ties that should bind them on a class level often don't. Now, Simon Jolivet has written an interesting book on French Canadian nationalism and Irish nationalism during the period of the Third Home Rule Bill right through to the Civil War and the creation of the Free State, where he sees a lot more complementarity between the two. Whereas I think there would be an interesting case to be made if someone were doing a study in Halifax, you know, who is the Catholic other here? I mean, historically, it's been the Scots. And I mean, even the creation of the Diocese of Halifax, you know, owes itself in part to this tension between Scots and Irish. Elsewhere, in Toronto, for example, it's measuring yourself against Catholics from Italy and Poland and Eastern and Central Europe. I mean, we just have different questions because of the way our communities have evolved. And our black populations, for example, I mean, are significant in some Canadian centers, but insignificant, you know, in others. But I mean, there's just, I would say that we have different categories of question framing here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just wondering, using your analogy of building from the goalie up, because Mount Olivet Cemetery had burials at the same time that Holy Cross did. Would the project be including statistics and data from Mount Olivet as the substitute goalie or the second string?
Actually, I think the backup goalie right now is to be St. Peter's Cemetery, which precedes Holy Cross, and that we're I don't know if I'm speaking out of turn, but we're still negotiating to get that database so that we can integrate that one. So that would be the backup goaltender, because that would give us, you know, a considerable data from the early colonial period. I'm not familiar with Mount Olivet, but I mean, our experts, Paul at the back there, Paul, you know this.
Not until the very late 1800s, just before 1900.
Yeah.
There was, you know, there certainly were Irish-born people who were buried there, but the numbers are far, far small. In fact, you know, hard to compare. They're so much smaller.
Right.
Numbers at Holy Cross.
I guess that's it. Oh, no, the good doctor, yes.
Yeah. Dr. Quack would like to say yeah, that your depth of knowledge is amazing, and your lecture was excellent, and we've learned a heck of a lot, and we thank you. I must say this has taught me that the medical education of doctors is lacking something terribly. We know nothing compared to what you academics know and have brought to bear in educating the rest of us, and we dearly thank you for being here.
Thanks very much.